By show of hands, how many of you have heard about the dog sled race, the Iditarod? Now, out of those people, how many of you know that the Iditarod is actually around because of an outbreak of diphtheria? Awesome. So, much like yourselves, I didn't know that. And as a kid, I would go downtown in Anchorage with my family, and I'd watch all of the mushers and their dogs race through. And my only interest was with how cute the dogs were. But as I grew up and I learned a lot more about the history, I came to appreciate the race and everything that it stood for. Mike McFate, in a New York Times article that was published in March of 2016, calls the Iditarod a race where dogs and humans are tested against the torments of isolation, fatigue, and harsh elements. So today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of the Iditarod and how it has changed and developed into what it is today. So our story begins in 1925 in a small town called Nome in Alaska. It has a population of around 1,500 people. The only doctor at the time, Dr. Curtis Welch, began receiving and hearing about children who were getting sick. However, he didn't know what it was. At first, he misdiagnosed some of the children and said that they had tonsillitis. But as more cases came in and more of the children began dying, he realized that he had an outbreak of diphtheria on his hands. The Journal of American Medical Association says that Welch submitted a letter in February of 1925 describing the epidemic and asking for help. Diphtheria, as defined by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, says it's a bacterial infection that is fairly contagious and if is left untreated, has a mortality rate of around 50%. So this was obviously a big issue. In addition, the small town of Nome had no antitoxin on hand that hadn't expired. So because of this, Welch and the mayor of Nome had a meeting to discuss all of their options. Some other problems that arose was Nome is in the northwest of Alaska, and so it was in the middle of the winter, and the two big ways to get there, the easiest and fastest ways, are by sea. However, the port was frozen up, and by air. However, it's too long. At the time, it was too long to fly, because the pilots, when they were in the air, when the sun would go down, it would be too cold, and the pilots would die mid-flight, so that wasn't an option. So they decided their only option was to have a relay of dog sled teams starting from Nenana, as you can see right here, and going all the way to Nome. So the reason they chose Nenana is because from Anchorage to Nenana, there's a railroad. So they were utilizing all of the possible ways of transportation to get it to Nome as fast as they possibly could. So this trail from Nenana to Nome is actually 674 miles, which usually takes, at the time, it took them around 30 days to complete. However, Dr. Welch said that the serum in the temperatures of interior Alaska could probably not last more than 6 days. Okay, so they sent out a call to all of the surrounding cities and found out that luckily there was a small supply in Anchorage. So as soon as they found that out, they sent that on the railroad and went straight to Nenana. As soon as it arrived in Nenana late at night, the first musher, Wild Bill Shannon, left in the middle of the night with him and his dogs. As the days passed and the serum passed from musher to musher, there were a lot of them, around 35 different mushers during the trail. And as it passed from person to person, the conditions got more and more dangerous. Mike Kopuk, in his book, The Race to Save Nome, published in 2006, says that the days had only around 3 to 4 hours of sunlight, and temperatures could dip to negative 64 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition, there are whiteout conditions that inflicted the sight of the dogs and the mushers because there was wind and a lot of snow and a lot of fog. The last musher of the leg is Gunnar Kaasen, and his lead dog is Balto, who some of you might know from the popular animated TV or animated movie Balto. So luckily he arrived in time. The trip took 5.5 days, and he was able to give the serum to Dr. Welch, and 64 of the patients were saved. The courageous and brave trip of all of the dogs and the mushers spread around the nation, and everyone was so interested, and just the story of all of these dogs and all of these mushers to save the lives of all of these children spread across the nation. And in fact, according to an article in the Saturday Evening Post, Ivor McIvor, published in 1954, said that a Balto statue is actually erected in Central Park in New York City in honor of the bravery and courage of both the dogs and the mushers. Now, 39 years later, in 1964, we meet Dorothy Page, who was the chairman of the Wassiliconik Centennial Committee. Now, the Iditarod Trail Committee, in their summary of the Iditarod, said that Page was in charge of organizing a historic event to honor the 100-year centennial since Alaska was bought from Russia, which happened in 1867. So she decided a good way would be to hold a dog sled race in honor of the mushers and the dogs. People who were in support of the idea helped her out, and volunteers cleared a trail. And in 1967, they held a 56-mile centennial race from Knik to Big Lake. In 1973, more proponents of a long-distance race, which mimicked the actual Iditarod Trail a lot more, they started a fundraising campaign, and it grew more and more, and luckily, in that year, in 1973, they were able to hold the first true Iditarod race. So, as you can see right here, it starts down around Anchorage and goes all the way up to Nome. So the trail itself is around 1,000 miles long, and every year, depending if it's on an even or an odd year, it changes routes. And this is to go through a lot more of the cities in the interior, because some of these cities and towns only have a couple hundred people, and the publicity and all of the money that comes from the Iditarod really boosts the economy. So they change the location to account to help out those towns. So just to give you perspective on how long this actually is, this is actually longer than it would take from us to go from Slough to Vancouver, Canada. In addition, so if you look at the route, it says that it starts in Anchorage. That's where they have the ceremonial start. So in Anchorage, we have a lot of celebrations, there's games, there's food, but the real start is about an hour north in Matanuska Valley. In an article in The Atlantic, Mark Durr in 1995 said that over the years, the popularity grew a lot and drew people from Czechoslovakia, Japan, Australia, Italy, and mushers from the lower 48. Every year, people all around the world come to celebrate all of the bravery and courage that was exhibited by those dogs and those mushers. To summarize, the Iditarod is more than just a simple race. It has a rich history that many people don't know, and it pushes the limits of humans and dogs. After hearing the history and the scope and magnificence of this race, I hope you have a newfound appreciation for it, much like I did when I was a kid. Now, next time March rolls around, I hope you look out for the cute dogs in the most exciting sport ever. Thank you.
Jaden, how was